And welcome to Leaders with Vision's Public Policy Forum Luncheon. We are delighted to have you here today. This is a very, very important subject relative to our children. If this is your first time to come, you will find that we have presenters from the different points of view. And in this case, in particular, there are two very different points of view, and that would be the governor and John White. And we have representatives from both of those. We have a representative from the Louisiana Federation of Teachers, representing the teachers' point of view, and representing the children's point of view. We have a lady from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and who they happen to be doing a project here in Louisiana. So we're pleased to have all four of our guests, and sit back, enjoy, learn, and save your questions till all four finish, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Okay? If we are ready, the first person to speak will be Erin Bentley, and she is here representing the Superintendent of Education, John White. Please welcome Erin.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Erin Bentley. I serve as the Assistant Superintendent for Policy and Governmental Affairs at the Department of Education. I'm here to talk today about the new federal law for education across our country, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act. So I'm going to probably use my time to really just set the stage for those of you who aren't familiar with this. What is ESSA? How does this require us to I'll talk a little bit about what ESSA is, what it requires us to do differently than what we have been doing, what's the process that we are using to develop a state plan in response to this new federal law, and then certainly we'll have an opportunity for you all to hear about how we have worked together. Okay, I don't, is this any better? A little? All right. So for those of you who aren't familiar, ESSA is what I'll call the current iteration of what was previously known as No Child Left Behind. It's the reauthorization of what began in 1965 as a civil rights law for our country, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was passed at the national level to assure that all students, regardless of background, income, race, ethnicity, that all children have access to a high-quality education. So, pursuant to that act, this new law, all states are really given an opportunity to design a long-term plan for education in a way that works for them. And I will say, if there's anything that marks the key differences between No Child Left Behind and ESSA, it is that when Congress passed ESSA, they did so with the intent of returning a good bit of decision-making power back down to the states. No longer having a one-size-fits-all approach where every state has to set the same metrics or have the same expectations, but really giving states the ability to work with their stakeholders within their states on a plan that works for them. Definitely holding all states to high standards when it comes to making sure that our children are being taught, to make sure we have high quality in the classroom, that we are preparing them for post-secondary education and the jobs of the future. But when it comes to the how, not the what, but the how, the states get to determine the how. How are we going to make sure that we get our children there and have them prepared for life? So after this law was enacted at the federal level, we began working with stakeholders to pour through what is probably a law that's well over 1,000 pages long, to understand all the nuances, to understand what is it as a state that we have to do to comply with this new federal law. We began working with a number of stakeholders. Some of them are represented here, educators at the teacher level, at the administrator level, parents, advocacy groups, business community, making sure that everyone understands what this new law is, what are the new expectations, and really starting a dialogue with them about what is it that we are doing well as a state that we feel like is serving students well, and we should continue that. And also be honest about where do we have challenges that despite our best efforts, there are some children that are still not being served well in our system, or there are things that we can do better, or we can take something that's working well and take it to a new level. So these are the conversations that we've been engaged in over the past several months, working with a number of formal advisory councils throughout the state, and there are several. One was just meeting this morning, the Superintendent's Advisory Council. We also have those same types of stakeholder advisory committees that exist for students with disabilities, for non-public schools. There's a state accountability commission that meets, that deals with really complex, technical issues of state accountability systems. So all of this has been going on over the past several months, and certainly input has been provided as to what things are working, what things need to be tweaked, where do changes need to be made so that we can address the challenges that we still have, and making sure that we serve our students at the levels that they need to be prepared. So I'll outline 5 key areas that we as a state have identified as priorities for our plan. And these mirror the same areas of the law where the law challenges states to address these issues head on. The first is our basic expectations for students, making sure that everything we do is designed to prepare students ultimately at the level that they need to be prepared to successfully transition into college or the workplace. That means that we set high expectations for teaching and learning in our state. That means that we measure student learning in a responsible way so that informs us of how well our children are doing and where they have challenges that we need to support. Another area is not just looking at the aggregate of how well are our students doing on average, or how well are students doing in a district or in a school, but even drilling down further. We have lots of schools across our state that appear to be doing very well on average, but if you really dig into the data, you will see sometimes that certain subgroups of students are still struggling. It could be your students with disabilities within that school. It could be your economically disadvantaged students in that school. So ESSA really directs states to not just pay attention to how well are students doing on average or in the aggregate, but challenges us to make sure that the needs of all students are being met and that we are obtaining the information to know whether they are doing well or not and to support them, provide the interventions and supports that are needed if we see that they are not. The third area is equity. ESSA also challenges states to make sure that states provide a well-rounded education to students. And I think rightly so, NCLB-focused states really around literacy and numeracy, English and math and reading. And I think that was appropriate. We know that across the country we were losing ground in terms of our students' preparedness in those areas. But I think an unintended consequence of that, I'll speed up, is that perhaps some other areas of focus were not prioritized. So they're really challenging us to make sure that there's a renewed focus on all of the other elements of what we know make up a good school, not just English and math.
Thank you.
Maybe someone will ask me a question and I can tell you the other two. Thank you.
I realize this is a great deal to cover, but as I look at the audience, I see a highly educated, knowledgeable audience that is going to zero in on what she has saw due to time restraints. And while I'm here, I also want to mention that we did invite Lobby, and we did invite Stand for Children, but they had conflicts and were not able to attend. So now we'll move to our next presenter, who is the new president of the Louisiana Federation of Teachers, Larry Carter. Please give him a welcome.
First of all, I want to say good morning, and that timer is scary. But I certainly want to echo what Aaron said as it relates to the No Child Left Behind law. It was to make sure that resources were targeted to students who are in need. And secondly, I certainly want to say that over the years, as the No Child Left Behind law was put into effect, both Republican and Democratic administrations kind of tweaked that over the years. And what we found, though, through that tweaking is it was aimed to make sure that federal assistance led to improved academic betterment for students in our state and also in the country. But what we found, though, is that the federal government had an overreach. We saw this play out in huge controversies over Common Core, standardized testing, and teacher evaluation. The new law, Every Student Succeed Act, tries to strike a right balance, we feel, and recognize the role of the states in deciding their own education policies. The federal government can no longer mandate the terms of teacher evaluation, and that it's up to the states to make this determination. The LFT will keep working to make sure we create an evaluation system that provides both accurate and fair assessments for teachers and school employees. What we found was ESSA actually helped to reset testing and accountability, aiming that the system was less test-based, bringing back the joy to teaching and learning. I have the distinct honor and privilege to really serve on both commissions. The commission that the Louisiana Department of Education put together, and also the commission that the governor put together. What I found that was quite different in the two commissions in terms of how they worked was that the commissions basically found two different ways in which they looked at, I guess, how we look at education for our state. And what I saw was one of the differences I've seen between the two commissions is the weight to place on student growth versus raw data. And I can remember having a conversation just recently about how raw data sometimes is hard to get, hard to find, but that there are some mechanisms inside the new regulations that really talk about other symptomatic issues that play a role in how students are successful or not successful. And so we'll get that answer questions like that a little later. But what we also felt was very difficult in this discussion was schools with challenges needed to see more emphasis on growth. They might not be able to reach the high bar that was set by the state, but they should get credit for moving forward to that target that was set for them. And you'll hear about the targets later. I don't want, because I see this is a very, astute audience that we have here. So we'll hopefully get those questions that we can dig a little deeper into those questions. But that at the same time, it would allow some schools, if they had incentives, to move forward towards that target, and that it would give them at least a baseline for which to improve. And it also gives them incentive to keep growing. The other problem we found, though, is that high-achieving schools have a different problem. It's much harder to show growth if you're already near the top of the scale. We would hate to see high-achieving schools paralyzed, or penalized at least, for their success. This is a problem with any formula, though. The manipulation of the formula and how that is discussed in our discussion that we've had can give very interesting results, both probably I would say unintended and intended. And so as we look forward, our challenges, I believe, will be for us to make sure that the formulas that are discussed by both commissions, that they come up with fair and accurate depictions of what actually happens in a school. One that takes more into account the differences of what makes for students' success as opposed to just the raw scores. But we can achieve, I think, the right balance when people of goodwill work together in at least the best interest of our students, our schools, and our communities. So I'll sit down and hopefully the questions by the group will hopefully spur more discussions about what we saw in terms of me sitting on both commissions and having at least some dialogue around what's best for our students in our state. And so I'll take my seat and look forward to the great questions that will come. Thank you.
Our next speaker is from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and she's an attorney, and Jennifer Cutler is here as well.
Thank you all for having me today. As Ms. Jean mentioned, my name is Jennifer, and I am a senior staff attorney at the Southern Poverty Law Center's Louisiana office. And I've spent almost my career of a decade, focusing entirely on education law and policy, particularly from a civil rights perspective. So it feels like a really natural fit that SPLC would be engaged in discussions around ESSA. As both speakers have already mentioned, ESSA is our newest reiteration of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which at its core is a civil rights statute. Now, of course, first and foremost, it's really a spending statute. It's about Congress saying we're going to give money to states and local school systems, and with that money, we're going to communicate what we think is important and what the priorities are. And so when you look throughout ESSA, embedded in it are principles about civil rights, about making sure that our public schools serve all kids, regardless of their zip code, regardless of the broken home that they came from and what they go home to at night, and asking adults to do uncomfortable things to do what's right for kids. So the discussion playing out in Louisiana has been a really rich and a very robust one. I've been very happy at the number of people that have come together to think about how do we make our public schools better. And I think if I could characterize, I think a lot of the trouble spots that we've been having, it's because adults are struggling to say that they're going to do the hard things for kids. Being willing to accept, what's going to happen in my school performance score if we raise the expectations of how we want children to succeed. And what I would urge is that this process is so important and that we need to be willing to keep pushing ourselves to be really honest about what we expect our public schools to be able to do for children. So I had the unique opportunity that I've been really engaged in discussions in Louisiana, but because the organization I work for is a national civil rights organization, I've also been participating in discussions happening at the federal level. And so I think the thing I'm seeing between those two spaces is that we increasingly have an administration and a federal government that is taking off the guardrails and saying, states, we are going to leave this up to you to figure out the right thing to do, which is a good thing for a lot of ways because states need some flexibility to be creative about what's right, but it's also a little bit of a scary thing because you don't really have much of a watchdog that's going to maybe ring the bell and say, are we actually enforcing civil rights? Are we protecting equity? And so I think that really puts the burden on us, whether you're a parent, a taxpayer, a community member, to step up and say, what is happening in our public schools? And do we think we're fulfilling these big promises that we've set out? So within a group of about 9 other organizations, we've put together a joint statement of what we think the priorities are around ESSA that we think would get us back to its civil rights core. And they fall under 3 big buckets, really. And they all come around themes of making sure that we are transparent about what's happening in our schools by making sure the public has access to information. And public, parents, taxpayers, all of us, do we understand how schools are performing? Does the rating system make sense? I shouldn't need a PhD to be able to understand a school report card, right? And we want the most low information parents to be able to look at that and have that make sense to them. Around accountability, I think we want to make sure that when we are saying schools are struggling, what are we doing to help them? And this is probably one of the things I'm most excited about with ESSA when you compare it to No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind set out basically a buffet of punishment for adults when they fail to serve students. And I think that's challenged us to increase our discussions around accountability, but I think it's also created a really toxic culture of fear. And teachers and administrators feeling very unsupported in their schools and now making them that much more reticent to say, I'm willing to do the tough thing for kids. Because we've set them up to say, if your school fails, well, maybe we'll just fire all the adults. So what I'm excited about with ESSA is that we are changing that culture of saying, instead of having a buffet of punishment, we're going to have a buffet of support. So if you are a dean of school and you're failing to serve a specific subgroup of students, let's change that dialogue to what we're going to do to help you. ESSA calls for something called a comprehensive needs assessment. And trust me, the devil is in the details on that. Who does the needs assessment? What does it look like? What is the process? These are all still discussions that we're having. But I think it's an important first step to say, if a school is struggling, let's go in and help. Let's not shut it down or punish people or move children around, because I feel like a lot of that becomes destabilizing for kids and families, and it also hides the ball on what's really happening. So I am very excited to really start to dig into not just how are we going to measure school performance, but what are we going to do with the ones that we all decide are struggling, and that we do it in a way that is supportive, involves the community, and is nurturing of kids, and also supportive of adults that are trying to do the right thing. So I'm not sure how much time I have left. I have a minute left. So I can go over the 3 big areas that we're proposing. Around school performance, we would like for there to be really uniform measures of accountability. If we compare apples to oranges to limes in terms of different assessments and that, having curves in our grading system, that it becomes very difficult to really understand how are our schools performing. So we want a really clear, straightforward accountability system that parents and even children can understand. We would also like to make sure that we communicate that school performance through a really simple letter grade system, and that we use the same metrics to compare everybody. So we would like a letter grade for the whole school. We would also like a letter grade for each subgroup of students. So let's be clear about how children with disabilities are performing in a school. If it's an A school for all kids, but kids with disabilities are performing at an F level, and that's concerning. And we want to figure out how do we lift up the most vulnerable students in the school. And last but not least, as I already addressed, the piece about helping struggling schools. We are excited to learn more about the comprehensive needs assessment that we understand will be happening, and we're looking forward to being really clear about actually connecting evidence-based supports to schools who are struggling, instead of, I think, getting away from that culture of punishment that we've had over the past 10 years. Perfect.
Thank you. And since she has brought up the fact about transparency, this is a little sidebar, but someone in this room needs to be recognized for his courageousness. Michael Deschantel, would you stand up? Michael was sued because he fought for transparency, and the LWVision Education Fund is collecting funds to help pay for his legal bill, because they did not award anything, even though the Department of Education lost. So if any of y'all feel generous, if you want to fight for transparency, please support this man, and let's give him a round of applause. Okay, and our next speaker, thank you so much. I just admire you so much. I want to share with y'all. Our next speaker is Donald Sanji. I told you I was going to have a hard time with that word. The Governor's Education Policy Advisor. Would you come up and give him a warm welcome?
Thank you, Dee. And thank you all for being here and showing an interest in education. I mean, that is the most important thing that we do as a state, as a country, is educate our young people. There's a couple of mentions about 1965. There are some of us who were actually alive in 1965 and remember that. The ESSA program was part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. He saw that poverty was such an issue, and it still is, unfortunately, but back in 1965, so part of his war on poverty was the ESSA Act to send money to children's schools in poverty areas. So it focused on poor children and to try to help to educate them so that they would improve their lives. Prior to 1965, there was probably no federal role at all in education. Very, very limited role at all. But that became something because there was a lot of money involved in it, and it went to these schools with children in poverty. In 2001, it was reauthorized as No Child Left Behind, and it took on an entirely different role. And instead of just supporting children who were in poverty, its philosophy was, I mean, no child left. Every child was going to be proficient. And as we said, there were so many consequences involved if they were. There's so many sanctions. And the goal was for every child to be proficient by 2014. Every child in every school, in every district in America was going to be proficient. And you know, it's a great goal, it's wonderful, we would love for that to happen, but in reality it did not happen. And as that 2015 was approaching, states decided, well, there's no way we're going to manage this, we want to avoid those penalties, so they applied for waivers and got waivers from the No Child Left Behind Act to the point where Congress realized that they had to do something different. So it's in a very bipartisan effort, In 2015, the Every Student Succeed Act was passed. And it took away a lot of the sanctions, it took away a lot of the federal control over education and brought it back to the states. And that's where we are right now looking at that. The Department of Education is going to submit a plan to the U.S. Department of Education. Our State Department will do that. And that's no different than they've done every year. Every year they submit a plan for the different titles. But this year it's going to be different in that it's going to conform to the Every Student Succeeds Act rather than No Child Left Behind. As part of that law, when the department, as the department prepares the plan and gets ready to submit it, it is required by law that the governor must review that plan. He's got 30 days to actually do a thorough review of the plan. And that's never happened before. Governors have never taken that much of a role in the federal plan. But this year, because of that, the governor has had to do that. So he has put together an advisory council consisting of educators, basically teachers, principals, superintendents, school board members. There's a representative for children with disabilities, and they are looking at our current accountability system, looking at what was required by No Child Left Behind, what is allowed by the ESSA law, and to make recommendations from the governor in this review of that plan. So they've looked at that, and I'm going to talk about maybe 3 or 4 areas that they see that's in our current accountability plan that they would like to see changed. That's been discussed. We've met, I think, 3 or 4 times. I'm going to meet one more time next week to come up with a final recommendation to the governor. There's no mention of teacher evaluation at all in ESSA. No Child Left Behind was very prescriptive in that teachers had to be highly qualified, and if they weren't, certain things would happen. Very little is mentioned about teachers at all in terms of teacher evaluation. But our group, one of the things that they brought up is that they would like to see changes in our teacher evaluation system in the state. That's one. The ESSA has reduced the actual requirements from a federal level of what tests need to be given to children. Right now, in Louisiana, in grades 3 through 8, we give a test every year in English, math, science, and social studies. And then in high school, they're given tests for 9th, 10th, and 11th grade in all those subjects as well. ESSA only requires English, language arts, and math for grades 3 through 8, and then science only 2 times within that entire period, and nothing for social studies. And the group that is part of the council has heard from teachers, has heard from parents, and really has gotten the message that we over-test kids. We test too much, and we rely too heavily on those tests. That the test drives everything that we do, that teachers tend, the curriculum is focused on the test, the teachers teach to the test, and the test becomes education, and rather than it being just a measurement of it. So that was another concern that they had. Ooh. Okay, letter grades, they didn't think that letter grades, the way they're currently done, really gives a true picture of that, that there's a better way to report school quality than just a single letter grade. And then funding, there's a disagreement between the council and what the superintendent is going to propose in terms of funding. And when I say funding, they send, for example, $400 million or so to the state for, how long can this run on? For the entire state, and the State Department can withhold a certain percentage, and that's where the issue comes up, is how much is that percentage?
Thank you very, very much. And now we'll go to our Q&A session. And I'd like to kick this off because I'm not an educator. I'm just a parent. I've got the other 16 hours with the children. Why wasn't there a parent on either of these panels?
I can tell you that we do have parents on.
Come up here.
I'm sorry. question is about the State Accountability Commission. There are parent representatives on the Accountability Commission. And generally, most of the advisory councils that we have at the state level do have parent representatives. And oftentimes, those are not just parents who may be appointed by our state board members to serve on advisory councils, but oftentimes those are organizations that exist to advocate on behalf of families and parents. Certainly, Jennifer's group, her organization with a number of those groups, Families Helping Families, communities and schools, urban league, these are all groups that really are meant to serve children and families. So a lot of the parent voice does come from those organizations.
And if I could respond about the Governance Council, whenever they meet, it's a public meeting, it's advertised, we encourage people to attend. We don't have a specific parent representative on the council, although we do have someone that represents children with disabilities. But we do have parents that come and speak. We allow public comments on all the issues that we've done. So we feel like we can get input from parents that way. And of course, if you have any other comments, I'll be glad to give you my phone number. You can let me know, because we want to hear what everyone has to say.
Okay, now let's hear from John. Who's got a question? John?
All right, I have two questions.
One at a time.
Okay. The first question is around,
Speak up.
is there room for innovation? Standardized tests and letter grades have an unintended consequence of requiring standardized teaching.
Do you want to direct that to any particular person, or you want the whole town then?
Whoever feels they have the education background necessary to
So first
respond.
question is about intervention.
Or it-
You only get to ask one question.
It's part of the same question.
Oh, it's part of the same question?
Mhm. So let me repeat the first part of the question. Is the way we're pursuing accountability, okay, with these standardized tests, having an unintended consequence of limiting innovation and forcing us to have this standardized way of teaching, okay? And in the same vein, how much of our current standardized testing reflects some level of elitism in the sense of there's a very narrow perception on what are measures of intelligence and education for our kids. Okay?
Karen?
I raised my hand to address this because the same exact question came up at a meeting this morning that a few of us were at. So the federal law does require that states use a single measure and that it be a consistent measure of measuring student learning across the board. Now, there are special tests that can be created for students with significant cognitive disabilities, for example, but unless you meet basically the standard to be able to take that test, the law does require, the federal law requires that you use a uniform assessment to make sure that you're not comparing, as Jennifer said, apples to oranges to limes. You have a consistent way to say, as a state, we have standards for teaching and learning. We want to be able to ensure that the measurement that we use to measure student learning is one that's valid, while at the same time allowing for accommodations where students may need those supports and those accommodations, or a different test that is more appropriate given where their needs are. Now, ESSA definitely, along with that requirement for consistency and measurement, ESSA also directs states to differentiate instruction to students to meet their individual needs. And to Jennifer's point earlier about, we have to remember this is a civil rights law. So yes, there are high standards and high expectations and high accountability, but at the same time, there is a mandate to pay attention to all students to make sure that all students are being well served. So when you put those things together, Many times that is the challenge for a state to figure out, how do we create this uniform system that allows us to have an accurate picture of how students are doing, but at the same time, use that information in a way to address the individual needs of students.
And if I can make a clarifying statement to my question.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay. One of my sons, very bright, okay, scored tremendously high on the IQ test in the 7th grade, because that was the year that he decided he was just as smart as his mama been telling him he was. Okay, he scored in the 96th percentile. But when you look at standardized tests, when you look at behavior in the classroom and lack of interest, and so it's important that we make sure we're being fair and equitable to a child that is more challenged. But I'm afraid that, especially as our society is changing more and more with technology, and not just technology, but all that has bloomed and blossomed because of technology, social media, blah, 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 are we taking an approach that's kind of, that will prevent us from being as innovative as we need to be for changing patterns? Is really the heart of my question.
Just quickly, I think the question that you asked about the innovation is one of the ones that I know as a commissioner and being a part of the commission, both commissions, that I think we struggle with in terms of how do we not be that system that we were, and how do we become a system that's more appropriate for educating students of today as we move towards a higher expectation for achievement. Today, basic is considered the mark. By what is it, 2024 or 2025? It's mastery.
Okay.
So you have to have schools at least fall in line with educating students to mastery, not to basic anymore, as they go moving forward, 2018 to 2025. And we're going to look at what that looks like in terms of the rubric to measure that. But it does seem as though there is a way in which we on the commission, and I know the Department of Ed, and I know the Governance Commission, is looking at how we do not stifle innovation in this process. So that's a great question. I know it's one that we struggle with, and we do have a lot of great discussions around that, and how we actually address that is around looking at the matrix and also looking at equity and fairness, but also there's part of that rubric that takes into some other accounts, not just the test itself. So I think as I sit on the commission and look at it, it's an area where there's a lot of participation around that we don't stick to the same old, but that we move in a direction to educate someone like your child.
Aaron, did you want to finish up? Since it was directed at this point.
I'll just add one point, and Larry mentioned this about the development of the next generation of our accountability system. One thing that we recognize that our system has lacked in the past is a recognition for individual child growth. That, the previous system really held all students to the same standard, and certainly we want mastery for every child. However, we have to be real that, let's just say a child who is economically disadvantaged or has a disability, what it takes to get that child to mastery may be very different for a child that does not have those challenges. And so one of the hard things that the commission has been debating recently is how to create a system that better motivates, recognizes, and rewards growth for children based on their own set of needs. And saying, Johnny may not be at mastery yet, but is he on track to getting there? And relative to other kids like Johnny, given his set of individual needs, is he outperforming his peers? Is value being added to him? So these are, these conversations get very complex and very technical as you talk about accountability formulas. But just know that the goal at the end of the day is to better recognize where growth is occurring, and certainly innovation is a critical part of achieving that growth for all kids. And that's something that really, I wouldn't say is so much about innovation happening at the state level or anything that the state is doing. That's really innovation that's happening in that classroom to meet the individual needs of children.
Thank you.
I did want to respond to that as well, because I think it goes to, that struggle of the philosophy of what do we expect in our accountability system. And I know it's been raised today that there's a debate right now, do we keep the subjects that we test just ELA and math, or do we test other subjects as well? And then I know folks start to get nervous because it's like more testing. So, and there's plenty of, I don't know that anyone has the right answer on that, right? On one hand, it's been made very clear in the actual federal law and in the discussions that have been happening at the state level as well, that we do want to cap the amount of time that teachers spend teaching to the test and prepping. And actually capping that to say, okay, you can't spend all your time just getting them ready for the ELA leap, right? That's inappropriate, because then all of a sudden you're not being creative, you're not creating interesting opportunities for learning in the classroom. On the other hand, I think our accountability system is basically us setting up the expectations for not just kids, but for adults as well. So if we don't put things in the accountability system and to say we value this, these are our set of values for our public school. So if we start to remove things and make the accountability system really narrow to maybe say just an ELA and a math test, I would argue that maybe then we're communicating that we don't care about other things besides ELA and math, and then that still communicates to a classroom teacher, at the end of the day, I'm only as good as that ELA or math score. So that's where I do think we are in a good transition point from, and I got the second draft of the ESSA state plan that just came out last week, that we are seeing this pie chart of what makes a good school and how much do each of the slices weigh. We're seeing some room made in there for other things that don't have to do with testing, which I think is a good idea. Right now, I think it weighs about 5%, so it's not a huge piece of it, but I think at least we're starting to communicate a different set of values, which is really good. I also do want to be clear, because Aaron had $1 for every time I complained to her about how we were going to measure that 5%. She'd be very rich and would have moved to Tahiti by now. So I have been critical about what we're going to do with that 5%, but I do think that's the right step to communicate a different set of values for what we expect in our schools.
And if I can say one more thing about the testing, even on the Governor's Council, there is disagreement over, whether we should test science, whether we should not test it, how much we should test it, and so forth. I've heard very good arguments on both sides, and if I were really a true politician, I would say I feel very strongly both ways. But the argument that if science is not tested, then it won't be taught, or it won't be taught well. Kind of, as a former science teacher, I'm kind of insulted by that. I'm going to teach science because it's a subject that I was trained to teach. I'm going to teach it because it's important. I'm going to teach it because there's a curriculum. And whether there's a standardized test at the end of the year or not, I'm going to test it with my regular classroom test. I'm going to let parents know how they do. But I'm not going to take that test and make my whole curriculum around the test. I'm going to teach science the way I feel like a science teacher should teach it, and that's just my opinion.
I'm going to do one follow-up on the questions that Dawn has raised. I, as an economic developer, have traveled through the Delta region and I've seen the schools up there. And when I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, they don't even have current textbooks. And you can forget about the modern technology. My question to all of you up here is, how are you going to evaluate children on an equal basis with all this testing when they don't even have the essential equipment in their schools? And in the poverty areas, this is a crucial challenge. This started off when we started with integration, okay, because the children in the schools of African descent did not have equal access to supplies, etc. Now that borderline is just a poverty line, okay? So how do you intend to address bringing schools in the Delta and over against the Texas border where the poverty is? How do you plan to bring all those schools up with the necessary resources to be able to compete on these tests? It's just that unfair unless you do.
And of course, you say, how do you evaluate those schools when they're not at the same level? I think it's important to still evaluate them because, I mean, they're going to go out to the world and the world's going to evaluate them. They're going to have to compete as a citizen of the state, the country, and the world. So to not evaluate them would be a disservice. But the question is, what do we do with that evaluation? How do we, in essence, kind of addresses that? If we have high poverty schools and they're not performing well, then there's got to be supports to take care of that. There's one thing that,
Donna, they need the supplies, current books.
Yes.
They need modern equipment.
it's a money thing. They
So what are you
don't,
gonna do?
well, we could take up a collection, I don't know. But seriously, we need to fund education adequately.
Yes.
I mean, that has to happen. And we need to find innovative ways of doing that. There's something trying to take place right now where we can provide internet access in these high poverty school districts. Working on that. That's going to involve E-rate, and it's really kind of complicated, but we're looking at some serious funding for that. But it's going to take funding to get a quality teacher. You look at some of the, there's school districts that have maybe 800 students in the whole parish. They don't have a grocery store in the parish. You can't find a teacher who's willing to move to that little town and teach, so they don't have certified teachers. So, and the other reason they don't have certified teachers is that they pay them $15,000 a year less than in a city maybe 60 miles away. So I mean, that's an issue too. And ESSA sort of addresses that. How do you get high quality teachers into high poverty areas? And that's been a challenge. I know as superintendent I had to face that, and it was just a struggle to do that. But I mean, if you look at a hospital, who's going to take care of the sickest patients? The best doctors. You put your best doctors at the ones who need it the most. In education, we don't do that. We need to find a way. It's a challenge. It's not an easy thing, but it's something we need to address. And ESSA has something in that, a part of it, where you need to at least look at the fact that your high poverty schools have just beginning teachers that don't have certified teachers, and what are you going to do about it?
Ted?
I was pleased to hear Ms. Coco talk about apples and oranges. I was very excited to hear that from Aaron talking about the subsets. I've looked at A and B districts and A and B schools and looked at DNF schools, and I've seen in some cases, particularly with the subsets, and I'll mention pre-reduced lunch, ESL, DLL, special ed, where our DNF schools are actually outperforming these A and B schools and districts at the same time. And so the only difference between these two districts is the percentage of the population within this school district compared to the other one. Why aren't we looking at these subsets separately, so we're comparing apples to apples instead of comparing apples to oranges, and look for statistical significance in the performance of the students in those subgroups? Would that not be a more accurate way to measure school performance in districts?
Good question. Who wants to take it?
I can say how very, very strongly I agree with you. To me, that's one of the most core components of what is making this new ESSA continue to be a civil rights statute, and that before it said you should at least report out how different subgroups are doing, but now it is a very clear mandate that the performance of each subgroup that you have in a school needs to show up on the report card, so that we know maybe this is a DNF school, but wow, look at all this progress that they're making with
They're
this.
outperforming in these categories. They're
Right.
not being at schools.
Yes, so I think that does go to your point where I think, addressing, now including growth as an actual part of the school performance score, I think is going to help with some of that. I would say just on even a basic transparency level, I still think we need to continue to fight to make sure that information is being clearly communicated so that it doesn't take researchers doing very complicated public records requests to dig through data and understand that. And so I would like for the report cards to communicate that up front, but I think you're right that we probably do need to continue thinking about if they're making progress with a vulnerable group, how do we celebrate that more rather than maybe putting a D label on them and think through what that means.
I agree with everything that's been said. Certainly this has been a challenge, as the Accountability Commission, has really waded into these very technical issues. On one hand, we are required to evaluate entire schools and to report on their performance, but on the other hand, and this is a positive thing, we're being challenged to go deeper. What does that mean for different subgroups within that school? How do we elevate information about the performance of those subgroups, whether it's a large population within that school or a small population within that school? And not only how do we make that information more transparent, but what do we do with it? And that's where we are really going to have to work over the next year to figure out what is our plan where you have an A school where a small group within that school are not being served well, or perhaps the reverse. So we're really taking a look, as the law requires us, to not only report out, but to make sure that we have an academic plan and one that is supported and aligned with our financial plan to address the needs of these schools that have underperforming subgroups. And I think there's an opportunity there too. There's a new area at ESSA where it directs us to identify schools that are what they call targeted support and intervention schools. And these are schools that may not have issues, in the aggregate, but when you really dig into their data and they have subgroup issues, there is money attached to that. There's a role that we play and a role that the school district plays in not only saying, now we're calling this information out, but what are we going to do about it? Here's some money and here's a grant that you can go and try to find, either a partner or develop a plan or deliver a new set of interventions and supports to address the needs of that particular student subgroup in a way that perhaps wasn't done before.
Very good question about the single letter grade, and a lot of people have a lot of disagreement with that. I think let's say I went to the doctors and had a checkup. He's not going to say, well, you got a B+. And then I walk, well, what's a B+ mean? Mm-hmm. Well, what's my cholesterol? What's my blood pressure? What's my PSA? They may all be good except my PSA may be out of sight, and I need to take care of that. Well, I need to know that information disaggregated like that. And I think it's important for schools too. If a school is doing a great job with children who are 2 or 3 years below level, they're picking them up, that needs to be highlighted. Because if my child is like that, then that's the school I want to pick. If there is, if you're going to choose a school, that's the school I would want to choose. Unfortunately, even if the Governor's Council recommends that, which I think they will, and even if Superintendent White would put that in his ESSA plan, it still wouldn't happen because there's a state law saying you have to have one letter. And even so, what's that? Yeah, it would have to be changed in the legislature, which is a whole different ballgame.
Just quickly. There is discussions among commissioners and other stakeholders around having multiple letter grades to identify not just the overall school, but you took what I was saying too, because it is a legislative piece of that. It's only one letter grade for the school, but there are commissioners and also stakeholders who have a discussion about multiple letter grades. You'll find though when you start hitting the schools where you have an A school that has an A for overall, but its subgroups are all over the place, where with African Americans, males, or students with disability, they have D's and F's. Think about what that projects to the community and how that would proceed. So there is discussions going on about that to really address that. And I think if there is going to be multiple letter grades, there has to be a legislative piece that we have to go through best into the legislation to change that letter grade piece. And it is being discussed.
Okay, Fred. She tells me to be brief, and y'all never saw a lawyer that can be brief. I want to acknowledge first full disclosure. I'm a part of the Edwards administration as the Assistant Secretary of the Department of Children and Family Services. Mr. Saunders, you and I are simpatico. That's a 1970s term for those of you who are younger. I just want to acknowledge that we've always had testing. That's never been an issue. Testing was not a problem because it was used as an assessment tool to determine where we needed to direct greater resources so that we could bring children up into status. But we talked about this being a civil rights issue, and I acknowledge that as a civil rights attorney, I understand that. But the thing about civil rights is that it wants to eradicate the disparity, right? And so when we're talking about directing funds and directing and being concerned about all children, I heard that term over and again, all children. We're not addressing this to all children. The experimentation is on children who are in public schools. Children in private and parochial schools are not subjected to this. And so if we're going to, if we're truly concerned about all of the children, and that's what it's about, we need to hold the private and parochial schools who do receive public funds to the same standard. It's not the experimentation that's been going on with children who are in public schools is absurd. And I'm going to stop because, okay, one other thing I want to, let me just say there's one other thing.
There's a question in
There's a question. I don't know if there's a question in there at all. I just wanted to get this out. My son, my one son, attended Baton Rouge High here in Baton Rouge. Those kids always tested like off the chart. They were from, majority of them were from middle and upper middle income families. They tested into the school, and of course they are all segregated there as the highest of achievers. Those children and that school is always going to be at the highest level. But what we don't acknowledge is that we take those kids out of communities, and their community schools test at the very bottom because all of the kids who would help them to bring up the standard are at another school, and that school is not being tested. That school is being tested in a different kind of way. The thing that we have to do, because this is a civil rights issue, it's a civil rights law, is to eradicate the disparity between the way that we experiment on kids who are in public school, and y'all know that's what it is, because we're never going to be able to test these kids into proficiency. We have to teach them into proficiency, and there was not a question, that was just my soapbox.
Product of Louisiana Public Schools. I have 2 children in Louisiana Public Schools here in East Baton Rouge Parish. So bear with me, my question will be kind of long. So, talk louder. Okay. So of course, I think most of us who are here support public education. I think we all recognize that we want to serve all children, regardless of race, socioeconomic background, and ability. But one of the premises to that, I think, is that we also believe it's a community's obligation, right, to provide that education for all children. Cornerstone of our democracy. Part of that obligation, I think, that doesn't get addressed very often is that the way a community accepts that or can fulfill that obligation, accepts that responsibility, and fulfills it is through the democratic process. If they have the democratic control of their schools, then they can be held responsible. Why is your community failing the children, all of the children in your community, by not providing them with a free and appropriate public education? So I'm looking at you because this is where the Southern Poverty Law sits. Not so much in how to design this accountability system, but I am very concerned about the consequences tied to this accountability system. Because the number one consequence to that single letter grade is the elimination of the democratic control of the public schools. And when you look at the accountability system, we can see that it is clearly, and I would say not a surprise, standardized tests have a history of discriminating against different races, different income brackets. And so you can see that the school accountability scores actually tell us more about the concentration of majority-minority communities and the concentration of poverty. So if the system is being designed in a way to target those communities for losing the democratic control, wouldn't it be a similar question of that consequence being unconstitutional, just in the way in which the voting rights laws recently were found, even though it wasn't identified to discriminate against majority-minority communities, it nonetheless did, and was therefore unconstitutional. And why hasn't the Southern Poverty Law Center, or the ACLU for that matter, been interested in pursuing an argument?
Excellent. Very difficult question. The heart of the reason of why we don't take maybe even more cases that have to do with public education. Because let me tell you, as a lawyer, I'm trained to be a lawyer, so my first instinct is go to court, right? Before I went into policy work, which is really, really hard. So I have endless respect for these folks that make their daily lives a
much more comfortable probably in a courtroom and making my arguments on my soapbox. The biggest issue that has really prevented us from thinking of ways that we can take some of these questions into a courthouse really has to do with constitutional issues of standing. What is the injury? So if we start to look at what feels like discrimination and feels like a disproportionate impact on race, I, as a private lawyer with private plaintiffs, I cannot bring that case into court. First of all, our Supreme Court has decided that there is no fundamental right to education, so I can't use the Equal Protection Clause, I can't use the 14th Amendment, that's not really available to me. And then when we look at the ways in which Title VI, which says we shall not discriminate against people based on race, when we look at that, that has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to basically foreclose private litigation unless there's direct evidence of intentional discrimination. And what that evidence looks like is incredibly hard to document. So we really had to think very creatively about when and why can we go to court. Now I know that there's some lawyers who have thought about the impact of, based on what maybe the state constitution says, and that we do have a federal fundamental right to vote, and the impact on the administration of public school boards. So there's some folks that have tried to think creatively about that. I know those are conversations that we participated in, looked in, and we didn't really feel like there was a theory that could hold up in court. I know it's really complicated, and I could talk about this for a long time, but why it won't work. The practical reality is that the group of children who have the strongest rights to appear in court and make complaints about their public education are children with disabilities.
But it's a question of voting rights. Instead of it being the community's ability to vote and elect representatives to control their public schools, wouldn't it be a community's right to bring that case and say, you are undermining my voting rights? I mean, my voting rights are undermined.
There are some folks who have thought through that. It would, I think, really depend on the ways in which schools had been removed from public control and were really truly under a private control, and it just gets really complicated. I wish I had a more nuanced answer. We had thought and had those conversations probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and we haven't really had them again recently, so I don't have a better, more nuanced answer for you than that. I could dig up some law review articles where people had laid out what that theory would look like. I know at the time that we looked at it, we just didn't think that there was a reason that we could appear in court. Yeah. Just to address maybe a different angle on that, there's this constant tension. It's been around for a while, and I'm sure it will continue for a while. Just this constant tension between the different roles of government and holding schools accountable for performance and protecting the rights of children to an excellent education. Definitely the role of the federal government is one, with strings attached. I'm sure many states would love to not have a forward plan or in any way be regulated by the federal government. However, that is what is needed in order to draw down hundreds of millions of dollars to support the most vulnerable children in our state. So what's the ultimate consequence that the feds could impose if they don't like what we're doing? They could yank our funding. And that not only affects us as adults, that affects children in the classroom. So that is certainly a last resort. At the state level, in our state and in many other states across the country, states have a tremendous amount of authority in overseeing public schools. I think everybody would agree that in a perfect world, local control would get the job done and would serve the interest of those students, and we want to see that happen. At the same time, our state and many other states have taken the position that if we see that those needs are not being met, then at a certain point, and in Louisiana, it is after 4 consecutive years, the state has the ability to intervene on behalf of those children. And those are elected officials as well. These are state legislators that have put laws on the books. They are accountable to their voters. They are elected into those positions. And that is a decision that they have made as a state legislature to say, yes, we are going to give local school systems the ability and empower them to serve children well, and we hope that that works. However, at the end of the day, we have to have something in place to make sure that if for whatever reason those children are not being served and we feel like there's a need to intervene, our state constitution and many other state constitutions across the country do give states the ability to intervene when they feel that that's necessary. one more point I think might be helpful. I should have also prefaced that the ESSA does not give any private citizens any enforceable rights in court. That's not what it is. So because that's also, I think, a common misconception that, well, you know, my district isn't following ESSA, so I would like to sue them because this is unfair. And unfortunately, and some of this even goes back to some core issues about the types of laws that Congress can even pass. Congress has chosen to make this a spending statute. They are allowed to do that pursuant to Article 1 of the Constitution. They can offer money to states in exchange for states doing lots of complicated things with the money. The IDEA is the same thing. It's a spending statute that way. So I think there was even a case, I think it was the state of Connecticut tried to sue the federal government for NCLB-related issues. I think it's Spellings v. Connecticut may have been the case. And the courts clarified that, no, this isn't a law that can be enforced in federal court, and particularly by private people. So really the mechanism of enforcement is about saying, you didn't do what you were supposed to do, so now I'm going to go complain or tattle on you to maybe the State Department of Ed if it's a district, or if you want to tattle on the State Department of Ed to the federal government. And the only consequence that anyone could seek is to say, well, then I'm going to take their money away from them. And as you know, an advocate for trying to make things better for kids, in the end, I question when we take money away, who's going to be punished at the end? It's going to be children who are in schools that have now had their money taken away for, you know, whatever federal law that they may have broken. So I think it makes it very, very, very complicated, particularly as an attorney, to navigate how do I do the things that feel morally right from a civil rights perspective, when legally I might not have a lot of tools in my toolkit to do something about them. And I think that's, again, why we find ourselves at the policy table over and over and over again.
1 minute? I promise I'll be real quick.
Is there a question?
I can't help that. But we just just as a civil rights attorney, the Southern Poverty Law Center, I mean, one of those organizations that I have great admiration for and am a member of. But you know, civil rights has never, ever been something where our government has laid out a clear avenue to pursue something against the government. It has always had to be something that was very creative. And so, you know, there are certain things that are built into our Constitution where we have the right, the absolute fundamental right to petition our government for redress of our grievances. So there are things that when we recognize them, there are things that are not specifically spelled out in particular laws that give us a right of action. And so we cannot give up because we think that there's a possibility that we won't win a lawsuit. Resources are always an issue, but there's always a way to get into court and to stay there. So, you know, don't give up where there's disparate treatment or a disparate impact on that. And no, there was no question.
I just wanted to clarify from Mr. Sanjay, I don't have a problem with a single letter grade. My point is that single letter grade needs to be based on the aggregate of those subsets. If Dutchtown has an A grade, but they're below the line on ESL, ELL, special ed, and pre-reduced lunch, that's not an A school. It just isn't. As a matter of fact, if they're C, if they're below the line with C's, then that's a C school.
Right, Aaron?